If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story.
The house sat on the outskirts of town, barely standing, its roof caved in at the edges, paint peeling away like dead skin. A rusted truck sat abandoned in the yard, its tires deflated, its windows clouded with years of grime. The mailbox leaned awkwardly to one side, its post cracked and rotting from neglect. This wasn't a home. It was a graveyard. And in the very back of the property, hidden behind the tangle of overgrown weeds and broken beer bottles, was the cage. It had once been silver, but years of rust had eaten away at the metal, leaving it brown and brittle, the bars bent in places as if the dog inside had once tried, long ago, to escape. Now he didn't try anymore. He didn't even lift his head when the wind howled through the trees, rattling the chain link like a ghost demanding to be set free. 4 years. 1,460 days of solitude, filth, and silence. His name was once Duke, a strong name, a noble name. A name he had long since forgotten. The only life he knew was this cage, this dirt, this misery. His owner, Clint Henshaw, was a mean, drunken man, a nobody with a violent temper and a long history of picking fights he never won. He lived alone, spending most of his days drowning in cheap whiskey and bad decisions, stumbling out of the rundown house only when he needed to relieve himself in the bushes or throw a half-eaten meal onto the ground near Duke's cage. Duke didn't move when food was thrown. He knew better. If he moved too quickly, Clint would swing the bottle instead of the scraps. So he waited. Waited for the man to stagger away, to forget he even existed, to return to his hole in the house where the stench of liquor and failure would swallow him whole. Only then did Duke inch forward, gnawing at whatever had been tossed his way, sometimes a stale burger bun, sometimes just bones stripped of everything edible. Sometimes nothing at all. The neighbors knew. Of course they knew. They heard the occasional whimper in the night, the clatter of a bottle against the cage, the low growls and drunken threats, that this was a place where people minded their business. "This town ain't got room for hero types," the gas station clerk had once said when a young woman asked why nobody did anything. "That dog ain't your problem." An old man had muttered when a teenager had tried to slip Duke some food through the fence. So nobody acted. Nobody spoke up, except for one woman. Miss Eleanor Green was nearly 76 years old, her bones fragile, her hands shaking from arthritis, but her eyes were sharp. She lived next door in a house that had been in her family for 3 generations. Every morning, just before sunrise, she sat on her porch with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the world come alive. And every morning she saw Duke in that cage, unmoving, a prisoner in his own life. She had tried. God knew she had tried. She had called animal control once, maybe twice, but Clint had a way of talking his way out of trouble. Said the dog was just old, that he was well-fed, well-treated, just preferred to stay in his cage. The officers left. The cage remained. So Eleanor did what she could. She left small bowls of food near the fence, pretending to drop them when Clint wasn't looking. Some days Duke was too weak to crawl forward and take them. Those days she sat on her porch and cried, gripping the arms of her rocking chair so tight her knuckles turned white. She prayed that someone would come. Prayed that someone braver than her, stronger than her, younger than her, would finally step in and do what she could not. And one day they did. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks across the dying grass as a man in his 30s pulled his truck into the gas station across from Clint's house. He stepped out, stretched his arms, and walked toward the small convenience store. His name was Ethan Calloway, a former firefighter turned animal rescuer, a man who had seen more cruelty in his years than most would in a lifetime. He had saved over 300 dogs, pulled them from fights, from burning buildings, from death itself. But he had never seen anything like Duke. It wasn't the cage that caught his eye, it was the silence. Most neglected dogs barked, cried, howled for freedom. Duke did nothing. He sat, his body still as stone, his ribs pressing against his filthy fur, his eyes half-lidded, deadened. Ethan felt his stomach twist. He had seen that look before, not in dogs, but in people. Soldiers, fire victims, abused children. It was the look of someone who had been abandoned for so long that hope had become a distant memory. Ethan took out his phone and snapped a picture. Then he called for help. Ethan didn't wait for permission. He crossed the road, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached the fence. Duke's ears twitched, just barely. He didn't lift his head. Ethan crouched near the edge of the property, voice low, steady. "Hey there, buddy," he murmured. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Duke didn't move. "That's okay," Ethan said, his voice gentle but full of unshakable certainty. "You don't know me yet, but I'm going to get you out of here." A movement from the porch. Clint, a shadowy figure, a bottle in hand, watching. Ethan felt rage coil in his chest, hot and suffocating. This man had done this. This man had stolen 4 years of life, 4 years of freedom, 4 years of happiness. Ethan turned, his gaze locked onto Clint's with a quiet, deadly promise. "You're going to let him go," Ethan said, his voice dangerously calm. "One way or another." Clint took a slow, mocking sip of his whiskey. Then he smiled, and everything got worse. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the yard, stretching toward the rusted cage that had become Duke's prison for 4 years. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of old whiskey, stale cigarette smoke, and something worse, the stench of rot, of urine-soaked fur, of a life lived in filth. Ethan Calloway's fists clenched at his sides, his heart beat a steady drum of anger, controlled but dangerous. He had seen neglect before, but this was something else. He knew the moment Clint Henshaw smiled at him from the porch that this wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't just about taking the dog. This was about power. Ethan took a slow step forward, his boots pressing into the dirt. Duke still didn't move. The dog barely seemed aware of the world anymore, his head hanging low, his ribs sharp beneath his matted, waist-covered fur. Clint chuckled, the sound slurred. "You're on my property, boy. That means you got about 10 seconds to tell me why before I get my shotgun." Ethan didn't flinch, didn't react. He had dealt with men like this before. Men who thought their fists, their guns, their bravado made them untouchable. But this wasn't about Clint. This was about Duke. "I want the dog." Ethan's voice was calm, steady, unshakable. Clint blinked, then laughed, tipping his whiskey bottle toward his lips. "Yeah, you and every other damn bleeding heart that's come sniffing around here. That mutt's mine. Been mine for 4 years. Ethan's jaw clenched. "He's dying." Clint shrugged, as if the words meant nothing. "Ain't my problem. Dog don't work, dog don't eat, that's the way it is." Ethan felt rage like wildfire, the way it is. Like Duke's life was just another piece of trash to be discarded when it no longer served a purpose. Like he wasn't even a living thing, just another object Clint could use and throw away. Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'll take him off your hands." Clint squinted, rolling the whiskey bottle between his fingers. "How much?" Ethan froze. That single word made his stomach turn. How much? Like Duke was a product, like he could be bought and sold, like he wasn't even worth a name. Ethan wanted to rip the damn cage open, to put Clint on the ground and take Duke right then and there. But he couldn't. Not yet. So instead he pulled out his wallet. 500. Clint's lips curled in amusement. "That all?" Ethan's patience was a thread about to snap. He reached into his wallet again. 1,000. The smirk widened. Clint was playing with him now because he could, because he knew he had the power. Ethan exhaled, slow and controlled, then pulled out his last card. 1,500. Final offer. For a moment Clint hesitated. Not because he cared about Duke, but because $1,500 meant more alcohol, more gambling, more nights of drowning in his own filth. Finally, he smirked. "Guess that mutt ain't much use to me anymore." And just like that, Duke's life had been bought. Like he was nothing. Ethan moved toward the cage, his breath tight in his chest. This was the moment. The moment Duke would finally taste freedom. He reached for the lock, but his hands stopped, shaking slightly. Not from fear, from rage. The rust had fused the metal together, the hinges so corroded they barely moved. Ethan had to pry it open, the screech of metal so sharp it cut through the silence like a scream. And then, finally, the door was open. Duke didn't move. Ethan's chest tightened. "Come on, buddy. You're free now." Duke's ears twitched at the word free, but he didn't step forward, didn't even lift his head. Ethan felt something heavy press against his ribs. Duke didn't know. He had been in that cage so long. He didn't understand that there was anything beyond it. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against Duke's filthy, matted fur. The dog flinched. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. How many times had Clint hit him? Come on, Ethan tried again, his voice softer. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Duke's legs trembled, then he moved. One step, then another. And then he bolted, straight back into the cage, because it was the only thing he knew. Ethan's heart shattered. This wasn't just a rescue, this was going to be a battle. Clint cackled. See that? You don't want to go with you. Guess you wasted your money. Ethan clenched his fists. Shut up. Clint's grin faltered. Ethan was done playing games. He stepped into the cage, the stench of rot and urine so thick it burned his nose, but he didn't care. He got down on his hands and knees in the filth and crawled toward Duke. The dog pressed himself against the corner, shaking. Ethan reached out. You don't have to live like this anymore. Duke's breath hitched. He stared at Ethan, not with trust but with hesitation. And then finally, he leaned forward. Ethan felt the wetness of a nose press against his fingers, a single tiny act of trust. It was all Ethan needed. He carefully lifted Duke into his arms. The dog was too weak to fight him off, too broken to resist. But as Ethan stepped out of that cage, Duke's body tensed again. Fear, panic. Ethan barely had time to react before the leash slipped off, and Duke was running straight back into the only world he had ever known, the cage, his prison. Ethan's stomach dropped. He had never seen anything like this. A dog so broken that he didn't understand that he had been rescued. And as Ethan stood there, staring at the dog who refused to leave his hell, he realized the truth. This wasn't over. Duke had been a prisoner for 4 years. It was going to take everything Ethan had to teach him what freedom really meant. The night air was heavy with the stench of rotting wood, spilled whiskey, and years of filth baked into the rusted bars of the cage. The stars overhead glowed faintly, distant and indifferent, as if they had witnessed too many horrors like this before. Ethan Calloway stood frozen, his hands trembling at his sides, watching as Duke, the dog who had just been rescued, ran straight back into his cage. It wasn't instinct, it wasn't hesitation, it was fear. Duke didn't understand freedom, because he had never had it. Ethan took a slow step forward, his boots crunching over broken glass and dirt. Duke was curled in the farthest corner of the cage, pressed against the metal bars like he could disappear into them. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, his body locked in the same rigid stillness as before. Ethan had rescued hundreds of dogs in his lifetime. Dogs who had been abused, neglected, abandoned. Dogs who had suffered at the hands of people who saw them as nothing more than disposable objects. But this was something else entirely. Duke wasn't just physically broken, he had been psychologically erased. His world was this cage, and anything outside of it was a threat. Ethan crouched, keeping his voice steady. You don't have to stay in there, buddy. No one's gonna hurt you anymore. Duke's eyes flickered toward him. A brief flash of recognition of something buried so deep it barely existed anymore. But he didn't move, not an inch. Ethan gritted his teeth. This wasn't going to be easy. Behind him, Clint Henshaw let out a low, amused chuckle. Told you, he don't want to go. Ethan didn't even look at him. He wasn't playing this game. Instead, he turned back to Duke, his voice dropping into a whisper. You've been in this cage for too long, haven't you? Duke's ears twitched, just barely. Ethan felt something stir inside him. There was still a part of this dog that was listening. Still a part of him that wanted to believe. Ethan inhaled slowly, then, to Clint's drunken amusement, he stepped forward, into the cage. The stench was unbearable. The floor was thick with old feces, damp with urine, crawling with flies. Ethan ignored it. He dropped to his knees in the filth and moved forward. Duke shrank back. Ethan stopped, giving him space. He held out his hand, palm up, close enough for Duke to sniff but far enough that he wasn't forcing anything. I'm not going anywhere, buddy, Ethan murmured. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, a slow, cautious movement. Duke's nose twitched. He inched forward. Just an inch. Barely a breath of movement. And then, he touched Ethan's hand. It was so small, so fragile, but it was a crack in the walls Duke had built around himself. Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat. Good boy, he whispered. Duke let out a breath, a shaky, exhausted exhale that spoke of years of suffering. The first crack in his prison, Ethan didn't push him, didn't rush him. He stayed there, kneeling in filth and rot and neglect, waiting for Duke to understand, waiting for him to decide. Finally, slowly, carefully, Duke took one step forward, then another, and another. And then he was out of the cage, out of his prison. Ethan felt his breath hitch. 4 years of suffering, erased in a single step. But as soon as Duke realized where he was, panic overtook him. He spun, wild-eyed, trying to bolt back into the only world he knew. Ethan moved on instinct. He grabbed Duke, not roughly, not forcefully, but with steady, unshakable control. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, holding the trembling dog against him. "You're okay." Duke shook in his arms, his body vibrating with terror. But he didn't bite, didn't fight, didn't run. Because for the first time in his life, someone wasn't hurting him. Ethan exhaled slowly. "That's it, buddy. Just breathe." And this time, Duke listened. Ethan carried Duke across the yard. Clint didn't stop him, didn't say a word. Because he had already been paid. Because Duke's life had been bought and sold like a second-hand object. Ethan felt disgust twist in his gut. He turned back at the last second, meeting Clint's smug, drunken gaze. "You're lucky," Ethan said, his voice dangerously low. Clint snorted. "Oh yeah, why's that?" Ethan's fingers tightened against Duke's trembling body. "Because I care more about this dog than I do about putting your worthless ass in the ground." Clint's smirk faltered. Ethan didn't wait for a response. He walked away. The drive home was silent. Duke lay curled in the back seat, his body still tense, but not fighting. He didn't sleep, didn't close his eyes, because this was all new, all terrifying. Ethan kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his heart aching for him. "You're safe now, buddy," he murmured. Duke didn't react, because he didn't believe it yet. When they got home, Ethan didn't rush him. He carried Duke inside, set him gently on a soft blanket, gave him space. He didn't force a bath, didn't force food, just let Duke exist in this new world. And then, in the middle of the night, the moment that broke him. Ethan was sitting nearby, watching over him. And for the first time, Duke crawled forward. Not far. Not all the way. Just enough to lay his head on Ethan's foot. Ethan's chest tightened, his throat burning. "You're okay," he whispered, running his fingers gently through Duke's fur. Duke let out a breath, a deep, shaky, trusting breath. And for the first time since leaving that cage, he closed his eyes. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Ethan sat on the wooden floor of his living room, his back against the couch, staring at the broken soul lying just a few feet away from him. Duke had curled into himself, his body tense even as he rested. His matted fur was still thick with grime, filth clinging to his skin like a second layer of suffering. He hadn't moved since Ethan brought him in. Hadn't explored, hadn't even sniffed the air. Because he didn't know how. For 4 years, his world had been no bigger than a rusted cage. And now, in the vast space of Ethan's home, he was more terrified than ever. Ethan exhaled slowly, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. Duke wasn't like the other rescues, the ones who bolted out of their chains the moment they got the chance, the ones who ran wild in the grass with pure joy, the ones who fought to reclaim their lives. Duke had forgotten what it meant to want something. The sun crept over the horizon, golden light spilling into the room through the sheer curtains. Ethan stirred awake, blinking away sleep. He had passed out sitting on the floor, his body stiff and aching. Then he noticed. Duke was still lying in the same exact position. He hadn't moved all night. Ethan's stomach twisted. "Duke?" The dog's ears twitched at his name, but he didn't lift his head. Ethan shifted closer, slow and careful, his hand hovering over Duke's head. The dog flinched, his entire body recoiling. Panic flooded his eyes, his breath turning shallow fast. Ethan pulled back immediately. Okay, I won't touch you. It's okay." Duke's ribs rose and fell in uneven breaths, his body still pressed tightly against the blanket, as if the floor itself was unsafe. Ethan exhaled, his heart aching. How long had it been since this dog had felt a kind hand? How many nights had he spent curled in his own filth, waiting for the next blow? He ran a hand down his face, sighing. "All right, buddy, we'll do this your way." Ethan moved slowly that morning. He set out a bowl of fresh water just a few feet away from Duke. The dog stared at it, but didn't move. Next, Ethan placed a small plate of boiled chicken nearby, the scent filling the room. Duke's nose twitched, but still, he refused to move. Ethan watched him with a mixture of frustration and heartbreak. It wasn't that Duke wasn't hungry, he just didn't know it was his. For years, he had learned that food only came when it was thrown at him, that any movement toward it meant a kick to the ribs, a fist to the face. Survival had been a game of staying small, staying invisible. Now, given the chance to take freely, he didn't know how. Ethan had seen dogs like this before, but never this bad. He took a deep breath. "Okay, buddy, we'll try something else." That evening, Ethan did something he never did with rescue dogs. He cooked a full meal for himself and sat down right next to Duke, eating in front of him. The smell of roasted chicken and rice filled the air, warm and rich. Duke watched, his body tensed, wary. Ethan made sure to exaggerate every bite, every chew. He hummed in appreciation, acted like it was the best meal of his life. Then he took a piece of chicken and placed it on the floor right next to him. Duke's eyes locked onto it, but he didn't move. Ethan bit back a sigh. He couldn't force this. Instead, he reached for his phone, scrolling absently, pretending not to care. Minutes passed. Then, the faintest sound, a shuffle, a hesitant movement. Ethan held his breath, keeping his eyes on his phone. He didn't dare look. Then, a soft crunch. Duke had taken the bite. Ethan let out a slow breath. It wasn't much, but it was something. The following days were painstakingly slow. Duke would eat, but only if Ethan wasn't looking. He would drink water, but only when the house was completely silent. Every new sound made him flinch. Every movement sent his body shrinking into itself. But Ethan was patient. He had to be. Then, on the fifth night, everything changed. Ethan was sitting on the floor again, reading on his phone, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp. Then, a weight. Something lightly pressing against his foot. Ethan went still. Slowly, carefully, he looked down. Duke had moved. For the first time, he had moved toward Ethan willingly. His head, scars still visible beneath patches of shaved fur, was resting against Ethan's foot, his body curled close but not trembling. Ethan swallowed hard, blinking back the unexpected sting of tears. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't ruin this moment. Because for the first time in 4 years, Duke had chosen trust, and Ethan would never betray it. The next morning, Duke followed Ethan into the kitchen. His steps were hesitant, slow, but he was watching, learning. That afternoon, when Ethan sat down, Duke lay near him, still keeping a small distance but closer than before. By the end of the week, Duke took food from Ethan's hand, and then, the moment Ethan had been waiting for. The first real touch. Ethan was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Duke walked up to him, slow and careful. Ethan stayed still, his breath lodged in his throat. Then, Duke nudged his hand, a small hesitant press of his nose against Ethan's fingers. Ethan inhaled sharply. And slowly, carefully, he raised his hand and ran his fingers through Duke's fur. Duke didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He let it happen, and for the first time, Ethan felt him relax. Not completely, not fully, but just enough. Enough to say I want this. Enough to say I think I might be safe. Enough to say maybe I can heal. Ethan smiled softly, stroking the back of Duke's head. "You're gonna be okay, buddy," he whispered. And for the first time in Duke's life, he almost believed it. The crisp morning air carried the scent of damp grass and fresh earth as Ethan stepped onto the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The sky was a soft shade of blue, the kind of morning that felt full of possibility, full of new beginnings. But Duke wasn't thinking about new beginnings. He lay on the porch steps, his body still, watching Ethan's every move. Not with fear, but with something else. Something softer. Something that almost looked like trust. Ethan had learned to read Duke's eyes. The first day he brought him home, they were empty, devoid of anything but survival instinct. Now, there was something else, something fragile. Hope. Small, hesitant hope. But it was enough. Ethan didn't push him. He simply sat beside Duke, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not forcing the contact. "You're doing good, buddy," he murmured, sipping his coffee. "Real good." Duke let out a slow breath. The tension in his shoulders, once permanent, once unshakable, had begun to ease. Ethan smiled to himself, watching as Duke closed his eyes for a moment. This was progress. This was healing. And then, the sound of a car engine cut through the peace like a blade. Duke's body went rigid. Ethan's heartbeat spiked, because he knew that car, knew that sound. And the moment he saw the rusted, dented truck pull into his driveway, his blood turned to ice. Clint Henshaw, drunken, slurring, grinning like a man who thought the whole damn world owed him something. Ethan barely had time to react before Duke bolted, fast and desperate, straight for the house, straight for a place to hide. Ethan clenched his jaw, rage bubbling in his chest. This man had already taken 4 years from Duke. He wasn't going to take another second. Clint staggered out of the truck, bottle in hand, smirking. Well, ain't this nice? Boy goes and takes a dog from a man, then don't even say thank you when he gets a visitor. Ethan's fingernails dug into his palms. What the hell are you doing here? His voice was low, lethal. Clint shrugged, feigning innocence. Just came to check on old Duke. Figured maybe I ought to see how he's settling in. Ethan's blood boiled. You don't get to check on him, he snapped. You forfeited that right the second you locked him in a goddamn cage for 4 years. Clint's smirk didn't waver. That so? He took a slow step forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. Ethan didn't back up, didn't give an inch, because Clint wasn't here for Duke. He was here for control. He had lost once, and now he was trying to take it back. But Ethan wasn't the kind of man who let abusers win. Leave. Ethan's voice was a warning. Now. Clint chuckled. Funny thing about that, though. See, I've been thinking that dog? He was mine. And I don't like the idea of some do-gooder taking what's mine. Ethan saw red. Duke was not his. Duke had never been his. He had been his prisoner, his punching bag, his forgotten responsibility. And Ethan would be damned before he let him go back. You sold him to me, remember? Ethan gritted out. $1,500. That's more than you deserved. Clint took another slow sip from his bottle. Yeah, well, money spends quick, and I ain't so sure I should have let him go. Ethan felt the shift in the air. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was a threat, and before Ethan could move, Clint's hand was at his waist, reaching for something. A knife. Ethan didn't hesitate. He lunged. His fist collided with Clint's jaw, sending the drunken bastard stumbling backward. The whiskey bottle clattered to the ground, shattering against the gravel. Clint roared, swinging wildly, but Ethan dodged it with ease. He had trained for this. He was faster, stronger, sober. Clint was nothing but wasted muscle and bad decisions. Ethan grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the knife dropped from his fingers. Don't you ever come near Duke again, Ethan growled, his voice shaking with pure, unfiltered rage. Clint grinned, even as he gasped in pain. Damn, boy. You fight like you care. Ethan's grip tightened. I do. And then without another word, he shoved Clint away. The bastard stumbled, his pride more wounded than his body, glaring at Ethan with venom in his bloodshot eyes. This ain't over, Clint muttered. Ethan wiped his hand on his jeans, as if to rid himself of the filth of touching him. It is for you, he said coldly, because if I ever see you again, I swear to God, you won't be walking away. Clint hesitated, and for the first time, he looked unsure. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. Ethan knew exactly what he was thinking. Was this fight worth it? Was Duke really worth another beating? And Clint, weak, worthless Clint, decided he wasn't. With a final bitter curse, he turned, stomped back to his truck, and peeled out of the driveway. The dust settled, the silence returned. But Ethan knew this wasn't over. Ethan turned toward the house. His hands were still shaking. He wasn't scared, he was angry. Because even after Clint was gone, his presence still poisoned the air. And Duke, poor broken Duke, was still hiding. Ethan stepped inside. Duke? His voice was softer now, gentler. It's okay, he's gone. Silence. Then, a faint shuffle. Ethan followed the sound, his chest aching when he found him. Curled up beneath the kitchen table, trembling. His tail tucked so tight it barely existed. Ethan lowered himself to the ground, his hands loose at his sides. He's never coming back, he whispered. I won't let him. Duke didn't move, didn't respond, but Ethan knew. He knew this had set them back. That Clint's face, his voice, his smell, had dragged Duke back into that cage, even if his body wasn't in it anymore. Ethan's jaw clenched. This isn't over, he whispered. Not for Clint, not for Duke. But no matter how long it took, he was going to prove to Duke that he would never be a prisoner again. Never. The house was silent, but the air was thick with something invisible, something suffocating. It wasn't just the lingering scent of whiskey and sweat that Clint had left behind. It was fear. Duke was still curled up beneath the kitchen table, his body locked in place, as if the world outside that small space was too much to bear. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his eyes wide, distant, somewhere else, somewhere far away, somewhere Ethan couldn't reach him. Not yet. Ethan sat on the floor across from him, keeping his movements slow. You're safe now, he murmured. I promise. Duke's ears twitched, but he didn't move. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had expected setbacks. Healing wasn't linear. Trust wasn't built overnight. But it still hurt, because just when Duke had started to believe, just when he had taken those first steps toward trust, Clint had ripped it away. The bastard might have left, but his presence was still here. Still wrapped around Duke like an iron chain, still dragging him back into the darkness. Ethan's jaw clenched. Clint had no idea what he had done, what he had taken. But Ethan knew one thing. He wasn't letting Duke slip away again. The hours passed slowly. Ethan remained close, never pushing, never reaching out too fast. He let Duke exist at his own pace, let him breathe without expectation. Eventually, as night fell, as the world outside quieted, Duke moved. Just an inch. A slow, hesitant stretch of his front paw. Ethan caught it, but he didn't react. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. Duke wasn't coming to him. Not yet. But he wasn't frozen anymore. And that was everything. The next morning, Ethan did something he had been avoiding. He picked up his phone and called Sheriff Markham. The line rang twice before the familiar gruff voice answered. Calloway, Ethan exhaled. Clint Henshaw showed up at my house yesterday. There was a pause. A heavy one. You okay? Yeah, but I'm telling you now, if that bastard tries anything again, I won't be calling next time. Markham sighed. I figured he'd pull something. He's been stirring up trouble, got himself banned from 3 bars in the last month. Ethan wasn't surprised. Clint had always been the kind of man who festered in his own misery, who let his failures turn into violence. He threatened to take Duke back. That got Markham's attention. He what? Ethan's fingers tightened around his phone. He was testing me, seeing if he could still control something. But I don't think he's done. Markham's voice was sharp. I'll have a word with him. But listen to me, Calloway. If he so much as steps on your property again, you call me. Not after. Not later. Right then. Ethan's jaw tensed. If he steps on my property again, he won't be leaving upright. Markham sighed. Jesus, Ethan. You didn't see what he did to that dog. Silence. Then, softer. Yeah, I did. Ethan closed his eyes. He wasn't the only one who had seen the scars Clint had left behind. The next few days were slow, careful, full of patience. Ethan let Duke set the pace. He didn't force him outside, didn't push him into new spaces. And little by little, Duke began to move again. He started eating without hesitation. He followed Ethan into different rooms. Not close, not too close, but near enough that it mattered. And then, on the 4th day after Clint's visit, Duke did something Ethan hadn't expected. He barked. A deep, guttural sound from deep within his chest. Not a bark of fear, not a bark of submission, a warning. Ethan turned so fast he nearly knocked over his coffee. Duke was standing in the doorway, his body rigid, ears alert, his gaze fixed on something beyond the porch. Ethan's stomach dropped. Clint? Again. The bastard was back. Ethan didn't rush him that morning. After Clint was gone, he walked back to the house, poured himself a coffee, and waited. Waited to see what Duke would do. Waited to see if he would follow. And he did. Not because he was being pulled or lured with food or coaxed with soft words, but because he wanted to. The final confrontation. Ethan was out the door before he could think. Clint stood at the edge of the driveway, smirking, as if daring Ethan to make the first move. Duke let out another low, menacing growl. Clint chuckled, tossing a cigarette onto the ground. Well, look at that. Mutt's got some fight in him after all. Ethan's blood boiled. You've got 3 seconds to turn around and leave. Clint didn't move, didn't back down. Thing is, he said slowly, I was talking to a guy in town, said maybe I should have never sold that dog. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Clint's eyes glinted. Tell you what, he said, voice dripping with malice. Why don't we settle this fair? You and me. 1-on-1, winner keeps the dog. Ethan exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, dangerous. You think Duke's something you can win? His voice was low, lethal. Clint grinned. I know he is. Ethan's hands itched to put this bastard in the dirt. But before he could react, before he could even move, Duke stepped forward. His tail was raised, his stance was strong, and for the first time, his eyes held fire. He was not afraid. Clint noticed. His smirk faltered, just a fraction. You don't get it, Ethan said softly. You already lost. Clint sneered. That so? Ethan nodded. Yeah, because you don't own him, and you never did. Duke let out one last warning growl, and Clint, for the first time in his life, felt fear. It was subtle, a shift in his stance, a flicker in his gaze. But Ethan saw it, and Duke felt it. Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice calm, deadly. "If you ever come near him again," he said, "I will end you." The threat hung in the air. Clint knew it wasn't a bluff. He hesitated. Then, with one last glance at Duke, one last sneer of defeat, he turned and walked back to his truck. The sound of the engine starting sent relief flooding through Ethan's body. But Duke didn't look away until Clint was gone, until the last echo of his past disappeared into the distance. And then, finally, Duke sat beside Ethan. Not behind him, beside him. Ethan's chest tightened. "You did good, buddy," he murmured. Duke exhaled, and for the first time he wasn't trembling. The dust had settled. The air was still. For the first time since Duke had stepped out of that rusted cage, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. Ethan stood beside him, staring down the empty driveway where Clint's truck had disappeared. He let out a slow breath, rubbing the tension from the back of his neck. He had no doubt Clint would be stupid enough to show up again, but it wouldn't matter. Duke had made his choice. And Clint had lost. Ethan turned to look at the dog beside him. Not behind him, not cowering in a corner, but beside him. Duke's eyes were clearer than they had ever been. For the first time there was no hesitation. No fear, just quiet strength. And for Ethan that meant everything. Because he had chosen Ethan. Because finally, he was free. That night, the house was quiet. The storm had passed. The air felt lighter. Ethan sat on the couch, his legs stretched out, a book resting on his lap. And Duke was lying at his feet. Not in the corner, not beneath the table. At his feet. The weight of that moment settled deep in Ethan's chest. Duke had spent years waiting for someone to hurt him. Now he was learning how to rest. Ethan reached down, his fingers brushing gently through Duke's fur. Duke didn't flinch, didn't shrink away. Instead, he let out a soft sigh, pressing his head against Ethan's leg. Ethan swallowed against the lump in his throat. "You're home, buddy?" he whispered. "No one's ever taken you away again." And Duke believed him, because for the first time in his life, he was safe. A week later, Ethan did something he hadn't dared to try before. He picked up Duke's leash, and instead of flinching, Duke wagged his tail. It was small, hesitant, barely there, but it was real. Ethan smiled. "Want to go for a walk?" Duke didn't run to hide, didn't drop his head. Instead, he took one slow step forward. Ethan clipped the leash on, not too tight, not controlling, just enough to let Duke know that he was never alone. And together, side by side, they stepped out into the world. Not as rescuer and victim, not as owner and pet, but as two souls who had saved each other. Because Duke had survived 4 years of hell. And Ethan had waited his whole life to save a dog like him. And now they were both finally free.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.